My beloved child, something hidden beneath years of unanswered questions has finally surfaced, and the DNA test did not reveal what anyone expected. For so long, your soulmate's family carried one unshakable belief: there was a reason the two of you should never marry. They treated that belief like an unquestionable truth, even when nobody could fully explain where it began. But now, one ordinary test has opened a door they thought would remain closed forever. And here is where everything changes. The results did not simply provide information. They challenged an entire family story. Your soulmate stared at those details longer than anyone realized, reading them once, then again, trying to understand how a few lines could rearrange everything they had been told about their past. Suddenly, old conversations sounded different. Family warnings felt incomplete. Decisions that once appeared final began to look as though they had been built on assumptions rather than facts. Stay a little longer, because the most important discovery was not written in the first line of that report. For years, someone in the family had protected an old version of the story. Perhaps they believed they were protecting tradition. Perhaps they thought they were preventing future complications. Whatever the reason, your soulmate grew up hearing that certain boundaries could never be crossed, and somehow, your connection became one of them. But the DNA results introduced a missing piece. A piece nobody had prepared for. Your soulmate began asking questions. Quietly at first. Why had nobody checked the facts earlier? Why had certain relatives avoided explaining the past? And why did the strongest objections to marrying you suddenly become harder to defend once the results appeared? What if the barrier between you was never destiny at all? That question changed the atmosphere. Because this test did not magically decide who should love whom. It did something more powerful: it separated evidence from assumptions. And when that happened, the family had to confront the possibility that a decision affecting two lives had been influenced by a misunderstanding carried forward for years. But wait, the biggest turn was still coming. One older relative recognized something in the results almost immediately. Their expression changed before they said a single word. Your soulmate noticed it. Everyone did. Then came a sentence nobody expected. There is something about our family history you were never told. Silence followed. Not because something terrible had been discovered, but because the story everyone thought they understood was suddenly incomplete. Your soulmate realized this was bigger than permission. Bigger than an argument. Bigger even than marriage. This was about identity, truth, and finally understanding why the path toward you had always seemed surrounded by unexplained resistance. And strangely, instead of pulling away, your soulmate felt clearer. Because once truth enters the room, old confusion cannot remain comfortable forever. You might miss the turning point if you leave now, because the next detail explains why the family had been so certain about keeping you apart, and why that certainty began collapsing the moment the DNA results were compared with a piece of family history that had been hidden for years. Your soulmate looked across the room and understood something extraordinary. Maybe the future was never blocked. Maybe everyone had simply been following the wrong map. And now that map was about to be rewritten. The room did not become louder after that revelation. It became quieter, and somehow, that silence said more than any argument ever could. Your soulmate watched the older relative reach for a forgotten family record, something that had rarely been discussed and almost never shown. Suddenly, the DNA test was no longer just a collection of percentages and connections. It was the key to a story that had been misunderstood for years. There was one detail everyone had overlooked. A branch of the family history had been recorded incorrectly. Not deliberately. Not as part of some dramatic scheme. It had simply been accepted generation after generation because nobody had ever possessed enough information to question it. And that old assumption had eventually become the reason your soulmate was told that marrying you could never happen. Think about that for a moment. Two people could have walked away from something meaningful because of a story neither of them created. But now the evidence was pointing somewhere completely different. Your soulmate leaned closer as names, dates, and connections were compared. One relative remembered a conversation from years earlier. Another suddenly recalled why certain documents never seemed to match. Pieces that once looked unrelated began forming a completely different picture. And then your soulmate asked the question everyone had been avoiding. If this is true, then what exactly was stopping us? Nobody answered immediately. Stay with this, because their silence was the answer before words ever arrived. The family had believed an old connection between the two family lines made your marriage inappropriate. Yet the DNA results challenged the very assumption on which that belief had been built. The relationship they thought existed between the families was not what generations of retelling had made it seem. The obstacle suddenly looked less like an unchangeable truth and more like an inherited misunderstanding. Your soulmate felt something shift inside. Not anger. Clarity. For the first time, they could separate what others had believed from what the evidence actually showed. And perhaps that is one of life's greatest turning points, the moment you stop living according to an old story simply because everyone around you has repeated it long enough. But there was still another question. Why had one family member always seemed uncomfortable whenever your name was mentioned? That answer had nothing to do with DNA percentages. It was connected to a promise made years ago. Before we uncover that missing piece, if this story is making you think about how easily assumptions can shape someone's future, share it with someone who values truth, leave your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe if you want to continue this journey together. Because what happened next changed your soulmate's understanding of the entire situation. The older relative finally explained that years earlier, two members of the families had made an informal agreement. They believed keeping future relationships between the families separate would prevent old misunderstandings from returning. Over time, however, the original reason disappeared while the rule remained. Your soulmate had inherited the restriction without inheriting the explanation. Until now. And suddenly everything made sense. The hesitation. The unexplained resistance. The repeated statement that marriage with you was simply not possible. But here's the twist, the DNA test did more than challenge the family's old assumption. It uncovered another connection, one that nobody in that room had been searching for. A name appeared. Someone your soulmate recognized immediately. And when that name was spoken aloud, one person at the table slowly looked up. Because they knew exactly who it belonged to. And what they revealed next would transform the family's shock into something none of them expected: relief. Nobody expected relief to be the emotion that followed. Yet the moment that familiar name was explained, the tension surrounding your soulmate began to change. The person connected to the DNA results was not proof that the family had been right to keep you apart. It was the missing link that showed how two separate family stories had accidentally been blended together over time. Your soulmate listened carefully as the oldest memories in the room were finally compared. One generation had remembered a surname. Another remembered a relationship. Someone else remembered an old disagreement. And somewhere between those fragments, an assumption had become a certainty. That certainty eventually reached your soulmate as a simple rule: you cannot marry this person. But nobody had stopped to ask whether the original story was accurate. Until the DNA test forced the question. Now imagine the realization crossing your soulmate's face. All those moments of wondering why something so genuine had encountered resistance. All those conversations where explanations seemed strangely incomplete. Suddenly, there was another possibility standing in front of everyone. The obstacle might never have belonged to the two of you. Wait until you hear what your soulmate said next. They did not demand an apology. They did not try to embarrass anyone for being mistaken. Instead, they looked around the room and calmly asked, "If we know more today than we knew yesterday, shouldn't our decision change too?" That question landed differently. Because sometimes growth begins when people become willing to update what they believe after receiving better information. One relative nodded. Then another. And the person who had resisted your relationship most strongly remained silent. Not because they were still certain. Because they were reconsidering everything. But there was one final layer your soulmate needed to understand. Why had that person fought so hard against the marriage even when others had begun questioning the old story? The answer came from somewhere unexpectedly human. They had once watched a relationship in the family become complicated because people ignored unresolved history. From that experience, they developed a powerful belief that preventing uncertainty was better than risking another misunderstanding. When your relationship appeared, they responded to the past instead of looking carefully at the present. Your soulmate finally understood. The resistance had never been proof that your connection was wrong. It had been evidence that someone else's unfinished story was influencing yours. And that distinction changed everything. Before you go, hear this line: sometimes the future does not arrive by defeating the past. Sometimes it arrives when the truth finally puts the past in its proper place. The DNA results could not promise a marriage. No test could decide what two people should choose. But they could remove the false assumption that had prevented an honest choice from happening. And now, for the first time, your soulmate could think about you without an inherited rule standing between you. Yet something else happened before the conversation ended. The relative who had opposed the marriage walked toward your soulmate carrying the old family record. They placed it on the table. Then they said something nobody expected to hear from them. "We made our decision using a story we never verified." Your soulmate looked at them, stunned. But the next sentence mattered even more. "If that story was wrong, then maybe you deserve the chance to make your own decision." And in that instant, the conversation was no longer about whether the family would control the future. It became about what your soulmate would choose now that the choice was finally theirs. Then came the moment nobody in that family could prepare for. Your soulmate was finally given the freedom they had spent years believing would never come. No inherited rule. No unexplained restriction. No old assumption deciding tomorrow before tomorrow even arrived. Just one clear question hanging in the room: now that the truth has changed everything, what do you truly want? Your soulmate did not answer immediately. And that pause mattered. Because freedom can feel strange when you have spent so long being told where the boundaries are. Your soulmate had imagined this moment many times, but imagination was different from standing inside it. The DNA results had challenged the family's original belief. The forgotten records had explained how the misunderstanding survived. And the relative who once resisted the marriage had finally admitted that yesterday's assumptions should not automatically control tomorrow's decisions. Still, something remained unfinished. Your soulmate turned toward the family and said, "I don't want to choose from pressure in either direction. I want to choose because I finally understand the truth." That changed the conversation again. What if this was the real revelation all along? Not that a test could guarantee two people belong together. Not that destiny had removed every challenge overnight. But that truth had restored something more valuable: the ability to make an honest decision without carrying someone else's misunderstanding. One family member smiled. Another quietly lowered their eyes, processing how much had changed within a single conversation. Then the person who had resisted you most strongly stepped forward. They admitted they had spent years protecting a conclusion without questioning the information beneath it. They believed they were helping. Now they understood that protection without truth could become limitation. And your soulmate heard the words they once thought were impossible. If this person brings honesty, respect, and peace into your life, then meet the future with your own eyes. Don't borrow ours. Something shifted. The family was no longer shocked merely because of what the DNA test showed. They were shocked by how one piece of verified information could expose the weakness of a belief everyone had treated as permanent. Stay until this final turn, because your soulmate still had one decision to make. They picked up the report, folded it carefully, and placed it beside the old family record. Past beside present. Assumption beside evidence. Then they said, "I know what I need to do next." And surprisingly, they did not announce a wedding. They did not make some dramatic promise about forever. They chose something stronger. A conversation with you. An honest one. No family whispers in the background. No mysterious rules. No pretending that unanswered questions did not exist. Your soulmate wanted the next chapter to begin with truth, because after everything that had surfaced, they understood that a lasting future could never be built on assumptions. And if this journey has reminded you that truth can completely change the direction of a story, share it with someone who might need that reminder. Tell me in the comments what you would choose in your soulmate's position, and subscribe if you want to stay connected to stories like this. But remember this final message. Sometimes what looks like rejection is actually a decision made with incomplete information. Sometimes what feels permanently closed is only waiting for someone brave enough to ask the right question. The DNA test did not write your soulmate's future. It simply removed an old story that had been writing it for them. Now the family knows. Your soulmate knows. And the path ahead belongs not to yesterday's assumptions, but to the choices made with clarity today. Because once the truth changes the map, you are no longer required to keep walking toward the wrong destination. But your soulmate did something nobody predicted after leaving that room. They did not rush toward a grand announcement. They did not treat the family's change of heart as the ending. Instead, they carried one question with them into the quiet. If the barrier was based on incomplete information, what else had been misunderstood along the way? That question led directly back to you. For years, your soulmate had interpreted certain moments through the family's warnings. A delayed conversation looked like distance. Your independence looked like uncertainty. Even ordinary misunderstanding sometimes seemed like confirmation that the relationship was never supposed to move forward. Now those memories looked completely different. The DNA discovery had not changed the past. It had changed the lens through which the past was being viewed. And suddenly, your soulmate remembered something you once said, something simple that barely seemed important at the time. You had wanted clarity rather than assumptions. You wanted choices to come from understanding instead of outside pressure. Back then, your soulmate could not fully appreciate those words. Now they could. Here is where the story takes another unexpected turn. Your soulmate began writing down everything they wanted to ask you. Not promises. Not conclusions. Questions. What did you understand about the family's resistance? What had you been feeling while they were pulling away? And most importantly, if both of you were finally free to look at the connection without an inherited story surrounding it, what would you choose today? Notice the difference. They were no longer asking, "Will my family allow this?" They were asking, "Can we build something honest?" That is a completely different future. Yet before your soulmate could reach out, another message arrived from the family. The same relative who had once defended the old restriction had discovered one final document connected to the family record. It did not overturn the DNA results. Instead, it confirmed why the confusion had lasted for so many years. Two people from different branches had shared nearly identical names. An old record had linked the wrong person to the wrong branch, and every generation afterward had repeated the connection as though it were established fact. Your soulmate stared at that discovery. One tiny historical mistake. Years of assumptions. And a relationship almost defined by it. But something powerful happened next. Instead of asking how much time had been lost, your soulmate began thinking about how much future remained. Because awareness changes the direction of a person who is willing to use it. Maybe that is the message hidden beneath this entire journey. Your future should not be controlled by information nobody is willing to examine. Respect the past. Learn from it. Listen carefully to people who care about you. But when new truth appears, have enough courage to reconsider the map. Your soulmate finally understood that. And now they were preparing to speak with you, not because a DNA test had told them whom to marry, but because it had removed the misunderstanding that once prevented the two of you from making that decision freely. Then your soulmate opened your contact. Their finger hovered over your name. For a second, every old warning returned. Then came the memory of that family room, the corrected record, and those unexpected words. Make your own decision. Your soulmate smiled. Because this time, whatever happened next would belong to the two people actually living the story. And just before reaching out, they whispered one quiet sentence. Now I finally know what was standing between us. But what they planned to tell you first was not about the DNA test. It was about something they had never admitted to you before.